Arrogant billionaire refuses to stand for black judge. What she does next leaves everyone stunned. Have you ever witnessed a moment so shocking that an entire courtroom gasps in unison? This is the story of a man whose wallet was bigger than his respect for others, a billionaire so consumed by his own grandeur that he refused the simplest gesture of basic courtesy, standing for a judge. Not just any judge, a brilliant, unflinching black woman determined to uphold justice no matter who towers before her bench. When he disrespected her in front of the entire court, people thought they'd seen it all, until she took action that none of them ever saw coming. Prepare for twists, betrayals, and a stunning lesson in karma that will leave you breathless. Alexander Steele was the name that graced magazine covers and headlined business blogs for over a decade. Born into a middle-class family on the outskirts of Chicago, he had somehow catapulted himself into the stratosphere of the ultra-rich by his early 40s. His rise was no small feat, a dazzling combination of relentless ambition, strategic alliances, and a willingness to bend moral and legal boundaries when necessary. The city loved and hated him in equal measure. On one hand, he was the glamorous face of modern capitalism, real estate developments, tech investments, philanthropic galas that boosted Chicago's prestige. On the other, he was rumored to engage in questionable deals that undercut local businesses, manipulated real estate prices, and crushed the little guy for his own gain. For a long time, those rumors were just that, rumors. Concrete evidence of wrongdoing never surfaced. Some believed it was because Alexander Steele was notoriously careful, surrounding himself with top-tier attorneys and accountants who could navigate the murkiest legal waters. Others insisted he had city officials in his pocket, ensuring his questionable activities were quietly pushed aside. The name Steele came to represent both extravagance and power, enough to intimidate even the bravest of souls. But on a crisp autumn morning, when the wind off Lake Michigan was already biting at people's ears, a monumental shift occurred. Steele was indicted by federal prosecutors on charges ranging from insider trading to bribery of public officials. It was like a shockwave throughout Chicago's business district. The Cook County Courthouse at 50W Washington Street, an imposing concrete giant that had seen its fair share of drama, became the epicenter of a media circus. Journalists, financial analysts, social commentators, all clamored to piece together the truth behind the sudden fall of this titan. Alexander's legal team sprang into action, filing motion after motion, each time pleading that the charges were baseless. By mid-afternoon, as the press swarmed outside, the courthouse staff struggled to accommodate the deluge of reporters. Even passers-by who had little interest in corporate politics stopped to gawk at the extravagantly dressed attorneys who dashed in and out of the building. A few onlookers couldn't help but speculate whether the rumor of Alexander's bribery had any merit. Whispers circulated about hush money, sealed documents, and secret bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. And yet, when the formal arraignment date was set, Alexander strutted up the courthouse steps as though he was walking into one of his own boardrooms. He wore a custom-tailored three-piece suit that must have cost a fortune, along with a defiant smirk that all but screamed his confidence that the law would bend in his favor. As cameras flashed, he offered the crowd a little wave, neither acknowledging nor denying his guilt, because in Alexander's world, he was untouchable. Inside the courthouse, in a wood-paneled chamber that smelled faintly of old books and fresh polish, Judge Natalia Coleman was finalizing her notes. She was one of Cook County's most respected judges, renowned for her sharp intellect, unwavering sense of justice, and a reputation for not bending to intimidation tactics. She had ascended to her position through sheer hard work, a groundbreaking figure in her own right. As a black woman from Chicago's South Side, she had faced more obstacles in her career than many of her colleagues could even fathom. She graduated top of her class at Harvard Law, clerked for a justice at the Illinois Supreme Court, and made her name prosecuting high-stakes federal cases before being appointed to the bench. Judge Coleman believed fiercely in the rule of law. Her career was dotted with triumphs where she had refused to compromise, even under enormous pressure. She had put away powerful drug lords, city council members accused of corruption, and even presided over white-collar crime cases involving executives with deep pockets. Through it all, she stayed calm, methodical, and impartial. If the evidence was there, it didn't matter whether you were a local thief or a Fortune 500 tycoon, she would hold you accountable. She read over the case briefs for People of Illinois versus Alexander Steele, quietly noting the potential complexities. Insider trading, bribery, fraud, these were not everyday slip-ups. They indicated a sophisticated, systemic approach to breaking the law. She wondered if the prosecution had solid evidence this time, or if the case would collapse under the weight of the Billionaire's defense team. She sighed slightly, reminding herself that everyone deserves a fair trial, no matter their reputation. That was how justice worked. A gentle knock on her chamber door preceded a court clerk entering to inform her that Steele was in the building and they were ready to proceed. Judge Coleman nodded, gathered her files, and rose. She smoothed her robe, placed her reading glasses gently on the table, and walked with resolute steps toward the bench, steeling herself for whatever theatrics might unfold in this high-profile case. A hush fell over the packed courtroom the moment Judge Coleman took her seat. The rapt attention from the spectators, media, and even the attorneys in the front rows spoke volumes about the magnitude of this hearing. A few bright flashes from cameras, though technically not allowed in the courtroom, still managed to illuminate the space momentarily. The judge's eyes flickered with disapproval at the photographers, who were quickly reprimanded by the bailiff. The hearing began with the usual formalities. The clerk recited the case number, the parties involved, and the nature of the charges. Alexander Steele sat at the defendant's table, flanked by two of the highest-paid criminal defense lawyers in the country. His posture was straight, confident, chin tilted slightly upward. Not once did his expression falter. He kept shifting his gaze between the judge, the prosecution, and the scattered journalists in the gallery. At one point, Judge Coleman asked everyone to stand in respect to the court, a standard tradition that every judge follows. The entire courtroom rose, prosecution, defense, spectators, even the reluctant paparazzi in the back, everyone but Alexander Steele. Instead, he shifted in his chair, crossing one leg over the other. A wave of gasps swept through the gallery, and the bailiff, a large, no-nonsense man, took a step forward, clearly waiting for the judge's signal to intervene. The hush grew heavier. Judge Coleman remained expressionless. If she was offended or shocked, she didn't show it. She calmly asked if the defendant was aware he was supposed to stand. Alexander responded with a voice that resonated condescension. "I'm perfectly aware, Your Honor, but I see no reason to perform meaningless rituals." His lawyer winced. The billionaire leaned back, unblinking, daring anyone to challenge his self-ascribed authority. A wave of disbelief spread through the spectators. Some even seemed to be holding their breath, as if expecting an explosion of anger or a charge of contempt on the spot. But Judge Coleman merely inclined her head. "Noted, Mr. Steele," she said, her tone even. "Let's proceed." That single moment etched itself into everyone's memory. It wasn't just that he refused to stand for a judge. Plenty of defendants had shown disrespect in court before. It was the pointed disregard for Judge Coleman's authority, layered with the undercurrent of his dismissive attitude toward her as a woman of color holding power over him. In the days that followed, That moment would replay on news broadcasts and become a trending clip on social media. People argued about his motivations. Was it outright racism, sheer arrogance, or a calculated ploy to set a certain narrative? For her part, Judge Coleman said nothing about the incident outside the courtroom. She had seen disrespect before, though perhaps not so brazen. She kept her focus on the law, determined to give a fair trial. If Alexander Steele wanted a spectacle, she would not give him the satisfaction of an emotional response. Little did he know, respect in her courtroom was not optional, and the consequences of his disregard for her authority had only just begun. In the immediate aftermath of that first hearing, local channels like WGN and major outlets like CNN had a field day. Billionaire's brazen display read one headline. Another anchor called it a direct challenge to the American justice system. Social media was ablaze with hashtags referencing Alexander Steele, Judge Coleman, and debates around race and class in the legal system. The footage of him sitting calmly, arms folded, while everyone else stood, played on a loop. It fueled public outrage, though there was also a curious subset of supporters who praised his boldness and claimed that the justice system was biased against successful people. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Alexander's PR team tried to control the damage. They insisted that this was a misunderstanding, that their client had a knee injury, or that he was momentarily distracted by a phone vibrating in his pocket. But these explanations rang hollow. The smirk on his face during the hearing told the real story. The arrogant billionaire had sent a clear message. He believed he was above the law, or at least above standard protocol. Judge Coleman was aware of the headlines. She would have had to live in a cave to avoid them, but she did not allow the attention to sway her. Her main focus was the evidence piling up from the prosecution. The case was complex, involving multiple shell companies, suspicious wire transfers, and testimonies from whistleblowers inside Steele's organizations. If even half of what the prosecution alleged was true, then Alexander Steele faced the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. Yet she knew how cunning the defense lawyers could be. They would do everything in their power to manipulate or discredit the evidence. The trial promised to be one of the most intense of her career. In the weeks that followed, as motions were filed and depositions taken, the tension within the city grew. Alexander continued making public appearances where he would sneer at reporters' questions. He hosted an exclusive fundraiser for a local politician, fueling speculation that he was trying to buy influence. He even appeared on a late-night talk show, joking dismissively about bowing to any judge, fueling more outrage. Online, Judge Coleman received anonymous hate mail, some calling her a racist for presiding over a case against a wealthy white man. Others hurled sexist slurs, mocking her ability to handle someone of Steele's stature. Though she had thick skin, each letter was a reminder that her every decision would be scrutinized. She refused to let it deter her. If she faltered, if she caved under pressure, justice would suffer. She had seen too many examples in history of judges who bent to public opinion rather than following the rule of law. In private, she worked tirelessly, combing through thousands of pages of documents submitted by the prosecution and the defense. The weight of the case was monumental, yet it was the blatant disrespect that lingered in her mind. The arrogance of a man who believed his money placed him above decorum and above her authority. Still, no matter how personal his slight might have seemed to others, she viewed it all through the lens of a jurist, with objectivity, deliberation, and an eye on ensuring a fair process. Even if Alexander Steele refused to respect her, she respected the position she held and the oath she had taken. Little did he know that her calm demeanor concealed a steely resolve that would be his ultimate undoing. As the court date for the trial approached, the story grew more intricate. Journalists, private investigators, and even amateur sleuths on social media dug deep into Alexander Steele's background. Born Alexander R. Steinberg, he had shortened his last name in his 20s to sound more modern and authoritative, or so a biography on him suggested. Old acquaintances from his school days started talking, some describing him as an ambitious genius who'd lend a helping hand, others painting a portrait of a ruthless manipulator whose moral compass was skewed from the start. His empire, Steele Holdings, was a labyrinth of subsidiary companies that spanned real estate, pharmaceuticals, tech startups, and even a small airline. At the apex of this empire stood Alexander, a man who believed that the ends always justified the means. Many who worked for him described a tyrannical boss who demanded absolute loyalty. Rumors circulated about employees being bribed or threatened to keep them silent about shady dealings. There were also hushed tales of entire neighborhoods being bought out and razed for Steele's luxury developments, displacing low-income families. Each new revelation made it harder for the public to see him as a misunderstood tycoon. More people began to question if the charges had finally caught up with him. Was there more hidden beneath the surface? Yet, for all the negative press, Alexander's personal brand as a self-made success story still appealed to some segments of the population. High-profile celebrities and fellow billionaires had not entirely abandoned him. A few even rushed to his defense, claiming the case was a witch hunt or a ploy for political gain. Some argued that Judge Coleman, known for her no-nonsense approach and well-documented stance against corruption, was simply the wrong judge for someone who represented unbridled, free enterprise. Alexander, of course, loved every minute of the limelight. He fed off the attention, twisting the narrative so that he appeared as a victim of a prejudiced justice system. In one interview, when asked about his refusal to stand, he shrugged and said, "I don't kneel for anyone, whether it's a queen, a judge, or a corporate board. I stand on my own terms." The interviewer tried to point out that standing in court was not kneeling, but her protest fell on deaf ears. He boasted that he would be exonerated, that his top-flight defense team would tear through the prosecution's flimsy arguments, and he'd be back to business as usual in no time. Stocks in his holdings dipped at first after the indictment, but then stabilized, largely due to his public relations offensives. It was a testament to how deeply money and media influence could shape public perception. All the while, in Judge Coleman's chamber, the wheels of justice turned at their own deliberate pace. She collected statements, analyzed legal precedents, and set boundaries for what evidence would be permissible in court. At night, when she finally found a moment to reflect, she thought of all the people whose lives had been destroyed or upended if the allegations against Steele were true. If justice was a balancing act, then she would ensure that the scales tipped only according to the truth. She was unwavering, even if the entire city seemed enthralled by the spectacle of the arrogant billionaire who dared to defy her authority. The day the trial commenced, it was as if all of Chicago paused. Reporters arrived at the courthouse before dawn, staking their spots on the sidewalk to broadcast live. The line of spectators, hoping to get into the courtroom, wrapped around the building, including law students eager to witness a historic trial, curious citizens, and protesters brandishing signs. Some signs demanded justice for working-class families. Others praised Alexander as a role model for free enterprise. The tension in the air was palpable, like static just before a thunderstorm. Judge Coleman walked into a courtroom that was hushed and packed to capacity. Even the aisle was lined with people standing, not a single seat left empty. She took her place on the bench, and the clerk asked everyone to rise. Again, as before, Alexander Steele did not stand. The bailiff's eyes darted to the judge, but she offered no immediate reprimand. The room's tension thickened to the point of suffocation. Once everyone was seated, Judge Coleman's gaze settled on Alexander, but she betrayed no outward reaction to his silent protest. The prosecution opened with a succinct yet damning statement, outlining how they intended to prove that Alexander Steele orchestrated elaborate financial schemes to enrich himself illegally. They presented their plan to show bank records, emails, and witness testimonies that would tie him to these crimes unequivocally. The lead prosecutor, a composed woman in her 50s, spoke with clarity and moral conviction, explaining that justice was not for sale, no matter how rich or powerful a person might be. Next came the defense, a dramatic flourish from one of Alexander's star attorneys, a man known for his presence in high-profile cases involving celebrities and corporate giants. He paced back and forth, painting his client as a visionary entrepreneur who had ruffled the feathers of jealous rivals and corrupt politicians. The charges, he claimed, were mere fabrications or misunderstandings born out of envy. He even alluded to the possibility that the judge herself might harbor a bias against wealthy individuals. At this, murmurs rippled through the gallery. Judge Coleman let the remarks slide, as the defense was free to craft its theory, but a faint spark lit in her eyes as she made notes on her pad. Alexander himself sat there, calm as ever, occasionally whispering to his attorneys. When the defense finished their opening statement, Judge Coleman thanked both parties. There was a short break before the first witnesses were called. During the recess, the corridor buzzed with conversation spectators, reporters, lawyers from unrelated cases, all discussing Alexander's refusal to stand, the pointed insinuations about the judge, and the upcoming evidence. Everyone felt that something big was brewing, that a confrontation was inevitable. Judge Coleman retreated to her chambers to gather her thoughts. She was used to defense strategies that tried to question her impartiality. It was a tactic as old as the courts themselves. Still, the personal attacks, especially those laced with racially charged undertones, would test her resolve. It was more crucial than ever to maintain composure. She had to be the anchor in the midst of a storm swirling with money, influence, and arrogance. After the recess, the prosecution called its first star witness, an accountant named Thomas Whitaker. Middle-aged, with thinning hair and nervous eyes, Thomas had worked at Steele Holdings for nearly 10 years. He claimed to have direct knowledge of how funds were funneled through shell corporations to bribe officials and manipulate stock prices. The moment Thomas took the stand, the mood in the courtroom shifted. Judge Coleman could sense the tension in his posture. He hesitated, looking at Alexander, who met his gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. The accountant cleared his throat and began to testify, recounting the elaborate system of coded transactions that obscured the real recipients of millions of dollars. The defense sprang into action, objecting repeatedly, alleging speculation, hearsay, or irrelevance. But the prosecution skillfully navigated these objections, backing each statement with documentation. Judge Coleman allowed the testimony, requiring the prosecution to meticulously establish the foundation for each exhibit. Spreadsheets, emails, and suspicious bank transfers flashed on a large screen in the courtroom. The numbers were dizzying, but the implication was clear. Alexander Steele had orchestrated a financial machine that enriched him at the expense of countless others, including small investors and even employees' pension funds. Midway through the testimony, Thomas revealed a crucial piece of evidence, an internal memo, allegedly approved by Alexander himself, outlining how to sidestep regulatory scrutiny. He said he'd seen Alexander sign it. Whispers filled the courtroom. Alexander's defense attorneys glowered, and one rose to challenge the document's authenticity. Thomas insisted it was authentic, and the prosecution mentioned they had a forensic analyst who would corroborate it later in the trial. The judge carefully noted every objection, every exhibit, her mind clicking away like a well-oiled machine. Throughout it all, Alexander did not flinch. He remained poised, occasionally conferring with his lawyers or shaking his head in feigned disbelief when the witness mentioned his direct involvement. Yet beneath that composed exterior, a new tightness in his jaw betrayed concern. Thomas's testimony was not easily dismissed. During cross-examination, the defense tried to paint Thomas as a disgruntled employee who had been fired for misconduct, implying he sought revenge. Thomas admitted he had been let go, but only after he threatened to go public with the information. The tension spiked. Why else would a long-time employee risk facing Alexander's wrath if he wasn't telling the truth? The jurors, a cross-section of Chicago citizens, leaned forward, clearly engrossed in the unfolding drama. Judge Coleman maintained strict discipline throughout the questioning. When the defense tried to badger the witness or insinuate irrelevancies, she intervened, reminding them to stay on track. No one could ignore Alexander's silent anger simmering beneath the surface. When Thomas stepped down from the stand, the prosecution's case looked significantly stronger. The crowd in the gallery exchanged excited glances. Could this be the unraveling of Alexander Steele's empire, or was there a hidden card up the defense's sleeve, waiting to be played? Later that afternoon, in a strategic move to salvage the blow inflicted by Thomas Whitaker's testimony, the defense called one of Alexander's longtime associates, a man named Henry Sharp, to the stand. Henry had served as Steele's right-hand man for years, rumored to be the fixer for any problems that arose in the company. If anyone knew how to spin a counter-narrative, it was him. Henry, dressed in an impeccable dark suit, sat with a polished air. Under direct examination by the defense, he painted Alexander as a principled businessman who demanded honesty and loyalty from his subordinates. He claimed that Thomas Whitaker was an opportunist who had tried to embezzle funds from the company. According to Henry, when Alexander discovered the breach, he took steps to terminate Thomas legally, setting the stage for Thomas's vendetta. The defense displayed their own documents, emails that seemed to show Thomas's misconduct, lines in spreadsheets that indicated discrepancies in accounting. Henry testified that Alexander had no involvement in any shady activity. Any suspicious documentation was part of a smear campaign orchestrated by employees like Thomas and external adversaries. Though the evidence was far from ironclad, it introduced doubt, sowing confusion among the jury. The defense aimed to pivot the focus onto the motivations of witnesses rather than the actual allegations against Alexander. For a moment, the strategy seemed to catch traction. The cross-examination by the prosecution had to navigate carefully, ensuring the jurors didn't get lost in the legal jargon or contradictory spreadsheets. Judge Coleman allowed both sides to present their arguments fully, reminding the jury repeatedly that their job was to determine the facts from the evidence presented and disregard any speculation. She remained vigilant about the defense's attempts to smear the whistleblower while offering minimal direct refutation of the incriminating documents. She had seen these tactics before, turning the trial into a circus of personal vendettas rather than focusing on the core question of guilt or innocence. As Henry Sharp finished his testimony, Alexander allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. For the first time since Thomas's damning account, it looked like the defense had gained some ground. The tension in the courtroom relaxed a fraction, and a few of Alexander's supporters in the gallery exchanged relieved nods. Yet Judge Coleman sensed that the defense's victory might be short-lived. The prosecutors were organized, with more witnesses lined up, more data to unveil, and a narrative that pointed straight to Steele's unbridled greed. The trial was still in its infancy, and the full weight of evidence was yet to descend. The trial continued for days, morphing into weeks. Each session brought new testimony, new pieces of evidence, and new revelations about Alexander Steele's corporate empire. Some days, the defense gained ground. Other days, the prosecution seemed to corner them with incriminating details. The media kept a scorecard, analyzing every witness, every exhibit, and every subtle facial expression from Judge Coleman or the jurors. One afternoon, after a particularly explosive testimony from a middle-level executive who corroborated parts of Thomas Whitaker's story, a sealed envelope arrived at the prosecution's office. Inside was a single USB drive and a short note, "Check me, I have the missing puzzle piece." It was signed only with the initials DP. Intrigued and cautious, the prosecution informed the judge in a private session. The court ordered a digital forensic analysis of the USB's contents. It contained encrypted files, detailed spreadsheets, and secret memoranda between Alexander Steele and various individuals, including city council members, referencing bribes, property deals, and insider stock trades. The data, if authenticated, could serve as the linchpin of the prosecution's case, tying together loose ends that had so far been speculative. Judge Coleman listened intently to the prosecution's request to admit the evidence. The defense, naturally, objected vigorously, questioning the source's credibility and the authenticity of the documents. It was a legal tug-of-war over chain of custody and reliability. After reviewing the forensic analyst's findings and hearing arguments from both sides, the judge made a provisional ruling allowing the evidence subject to further verification of authenticity and relevance. The defense seethed, but their attempts to block the evidence entirely failed. This USB became the center of discussion in the press and among the public. Who was DP, and what was their motivation in coming forward now? People speculated wildly. Some believed it was a mole from within Steele's organization. Others thought a competitor provided the documents. A few conspiracy theorists suggested it was someone in the government setting Alexander up. Regardless of the source, it was clear that these new documents might solidify the prosecution's narrative, linking the billionaire directly to illegal deals. Late at night, after the day's proceedings, Alexander Steele paced in the penthouse suite of his luxury apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. He was flanked by his legal team, who were combing through the newly admitted data. Despite the extravagant surroundings, the marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and priceless art, the atmosphere was grim. One by one, the attorneys explained the severity of each piece of evidence. The more they spoke, the deeper Alexander's scowl grew. If the evidence held up in court, his carefully constructed empire could collapse, and he might face real prison time. For the first time, the indomitable Alexander Steele felt a flicker of genuine fear, and with it came a wave of anger. He refused to let himself be brought down by what he saw as a nobody, a judge whose authority he had refused to acknowledge. In that moment, he resolved to fight even dirtier if he had to. He had no qualms about crossing lines if it meant saving himself. The question was, how far would he go, and would it be enough to outmaneuver the unyielding Judge Coleman? As the trial progressed, the defense escalated their tactics, perhaps sensing the walls closing in. They filed motion after motion, aiming to dismiss or suppress evidence. They hired private investigators to dig into the personal histories of key prosecution witnesses. They leaked stories to the media, claiming that Judge Coleman had attended events organized by political figures opposed to Alexander Steele's business expansions, suggesting a conflict of interest. It was all part of a concerted effort to muddy the waters, to plant seeds of doubt in the jury's mind, and to undermine the judge's credibility. Judge Coleman responded by maintaining her impartiality and dismissing the motions that lacked merit. She reminded the defense that personal attacks on the bench had no place in her courtroom. However, she didn't let their provocations get under her skin. If they expected her to lash out, they would be disappointed. Yet the public perception began to shift. A small vocal group rallied behind the defense's narrative, accusing the judge of bias. Social media accounts popped up, some claiming to be insider sources, revealing that Coleman had privately confessed to hating rich people. While none of these claims had any tangible evidence behind them, they circulated rapidly in certain online circles. For all her impartiality, Judge Coleman was still human, and the strain of constant character attacks weighed on her. Friends warned her that she might need police protection, given the hostility being stoked by Steele's supporters. The judge's husband, a pediatric surgeon, expressed worry about her well-being. Still, Coleman pushed forward. She understood that these were scare tactics designed to rattle her and shift attention from the mounting evidence against Steele. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, the prosecution continued meticulously demonstrating how the USB documents dovetailed with existing evidence. Forensic analysts confirmed that the files had not been tampered with. They matched verified email addresses and chat logs from within Steele Holdings. The new evidence established a pattern. Bribes were disguised as consulting fees, insider trades executed with coded instructions, and properties bought under shell companies that traced back to Steele's personal trust. Each day, the trial revealed more of Alexander's morally bankrupt empire, and each day, the billionaire's face hardened. If there was one thing more humiliating to him than being indicted, it was losing control of the narrative. He believed that power was his birthright, that others existed to serve his interests or be crushed. Now, with public sentiment increasingly leaning against him, he was on the verge of losing something more precious than money, the illusion of invulnerability. One morning, as the trial entered a phase where both sides were preparing for closing arguments, a pivotal moment arrived. The courtroom was packed as always. When Judge Coleman took the bench and the clerk asked everyone to stand, Alexander Steele remained seated, defiant as ever. But this time, the judge did something different. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice calm yet resonant, "this court has, in the interest of fairness, refrained from addressing your repeated refusal to observe standard protocol. But we have reached a stage where I can no longer overlook such deliberate contempt." A hush fell over the crowd. Alexander's attorneys stiffened. He stared at Judge Coleman with unmasked arrogance, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Are you aware, Mr. Steele, that by refusing to stand for this court, you are violating courtroom decorum and directly challenging the authority of the judiciary?" she asked. Alexander's lips curled. "I'm aware, Your Honor. I've made my stance clear." Judge Coleman's tone remained even. "Very well. Bailiff, please note for the record that the defendant has repeatedly refused to follow courtroom protocol, and it constitutes a deliberate act of contempt." The bailiff nodded, and murmurs swept through the spectators. The defense attorney leapt up in protest. "Your Honor, my client has a medical condition." But Alexander interrupted. "I don't need you to make excuses for me." He turned his gaze to Judge Coleman. "I refuse to stand for anyone who hasn't earned my respect." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Judge Coleman paused. In that silence, the tension was a living, breathing thing. Then, quietly, she declared, "Since you have made your contempt for this court explicit, you leave me no choice but to consider contempt charges in addition to the ones you already face. We will proceed with the trial, but be advised that your actions have consequences. For a split second, Alexander's gaze flickered, and he seemed to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had gone too far. The gallery buzzed with excitement and shock. The judge's measured words resonated beyond the courtroom walls, carried by reporters who immediately typed out updates and filmed quick segments. The scenario was unprecedented, a billionaire challenging the system openly, and the system embodied by Judge Coleman holding steady and standing firm. During a lunch recess soon after that confrontation, something unexpected happened. One of Alexander's lawyers approached Judge Coleman's clerk, requesting a private audience with the judge in her chambers. While such requests were unusual mid-trial, they could sometimes occur for official procedural matters. Judge Coleman, bound by judicial ethics, agreed only if both the prosecution and defense were present. In that cramped meeting space behind the courtroom, with both sides seated at a small table, Alexander's lead counsel began to speak in a conciliatory tone. They wanted to propose a plea deal. The terms involved Alexander paying a substantial fine, along with a minimal admission of wrongdoing, and in exchange, the more serious charges would be dropped. The defense argued that a prolonged trial would be costly for taxpayers and that a settlement might be in everyone's best interest. Judge Coleman listened intently. The prosecution gave her a loaded glance, indicating that they found the deal laughable given the seriousness of the charges. After hearing both sides, she simply said, "This is a matter for the prosecution to consider. I will review any agreement both parties reach and determine if it aligns with the interests of justice." However, the gravity of the allegations against Mr. Steele should not be underestimated. It was telling that the defense was now willing to talk deal. Perhaps the new evidence, along with the irreparable harm Alexander's public image was suffering, had them calculating that a controlled surrender might be preferable to a total defeat. Yet the prosecution stood firm. They believed they had the evidence to convict. A sweetheart deal would not serve the public. Alexander himself was not present in that meeting. His arrogance or pride likely kept him from bowing to negotiate in front of Judge Coleman. As the parties left, the possibility of a plea bargain hung in the air, but no definitive resolution emerged. It was a sign that the defense was feeling the heat, inching toward an outcome that might spare their client from the worst. But would Alexander's ego allow him to settle? Eventually, the day for closing arguments arrived. The jury filed into the box, appearing weary from the barrage of evidence, testimony, and legal complexities. The entire city seemed to be on edge, anticipating how this drama would conclude. The prosecution delivered a methodical, powerful summary. They underscored how the evidence consistently pointed to Alexander Steele's direct involvement in illegal trading, bribery, and manipulation of financial markets. They invoked the testimonies of Thomas Whitaker, the corroboration by other employees, and the incriminating files from the USB. Their message was clear. Alexander Steele believed he was above the law, but no one in America's justice system is too powerful to escape accountability. Next, the defense attempted to cast doubt on each piece of evidence, questioning the credibility of the witnesses and suggesting that the USB was planted or doctored. They tried to appeal to the jury's sense of reason, painting Alexander as a shrewd businessman targeted by envious rivals. They hammered home the notion that the judge might be biased, though they stopped short of direct accusations, perhaps recognizing how it might offend the jury, who had witnessed the judge's fairness throughout the trial. Throughout these final arguments, Alexander sat stoically, occasionally nodding in agreement with his attorneys or shaking his head at the prosecution's statements. He did not, however, stand when the judge entered or exited the courtroom, doubling down on his defiance. Judge Coleman gave the jury their instructions with utmost clarity, explaining the charges, the standards of proof, and how to weigh evidence against speculation. Her voice was calm, measured, a testament to her professionalism even under enormous scrutiny. When she was done, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The waiting game began. Deliberations stretched into an agonizing 2 days. Outside the courthouse, news vans lined the block. At every local diner and street corner, people debated whether Alexander's fortune and power would let him walk free, or if justice would finally prevail. On the morning of the third day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. A surge of anticipation rippled through the building. Everyone scrambled to their seats, hearts pounding. Alexander appeared with his usual composure, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of tension. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed in. The foreperson stood and read the verdict on each count. Guilty on 3 counts of insider trading. Guilty on 2 counts of bribery of public officials. Guilty on 1 count of securities fraud. The foreperson's voice did not waver. The cumulative weight of the guilty verdicts landed like a hammer in the hushed courtroom. Alexander Steele's face remained stone-like, but the flicker in his eyes exploded into a silent fury. Reporters scribbled notes feverishly, and the gallery buzzed in subdued excitement mixed with awe. Some of Alexander's supporters slumped in their seats, stunned. Judge Coleman thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the complexity of the case and commending them for their diligence. She then informed everyone that sentencing would be scheduled in a few weeks, pending a pre-sentencing report. As the bailiff instructed everyone to rise for the judge's exit, Alexander remained seated once again, but this time his posture was rigid, and his gaze drifted to some unfocused point in the distance. Power and influence had not saved him from the weight of evidence and the impartiality of the court. The man who once refused to stand for anyone had just been brought low by the very system he tried to defy. The sentencing day arrived under a sky heavy with grey clouds, as if the weather itself sensed the gravity of the occasion. The tension in the courthouse was even more intense than on verdict day. People speculated whether Alexander Steele would receive a slap on the wrist, a fine, and maybe a few months of incarceration at a minimum security facility, or a harsher penalty that could serve as a warning to other powerful figures tempted by corruption. Alexander entered the courtroom wearing a tailored suit, still exuding an air of confidence despite the guilty verdict. He glanced around at the assembled spectators, many of them victims of his schemes who wanted to witness his final comeuppance. Some had lost life savings, while others had been bulldozed out of neighborhoods that Alexander redeveloped for luxury condos. Emotions ran high. Judge Coleman took the bench. The clerk asked everyone to stand. Once again, Alexander refused. Once again, the tension spiked. Yet there was a resoluteness in the judge's eyes that hinted this day would not go as Alexander expected. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Coleman addressed the court. "Mr. Steele, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Throughout these proceedings, you have displayed a blatant disregard for the rule of law and the decorum of this courtroom. Your actions have harmed countless lives and undermined public trust in our institutions. I also note your repeated contemptuous behavior." She paused, her gaze steady. "In rendering this sentence, the court considers not only the severity of your crimes, but also your arrogance in believing yourself untouchable. This arrogance is not, in itself, a crime, but it has clearly fueled your willingness to break the law and disregard this court's authority." Alexander stared back, refusing to avert his eyes, though a muscle in his jaw twitched. Spectators leaned in, breath caught in their throats. Therefore, Judge Coleman continued, "For insider trading, securities fraud, and bribery, this court hereby sentences you, Alexander Steele, to 20 years in federal prison. Additionally, I am imposing a fine of $100 million along with full restitution to the victims as determined by the court's independent financial review. A collective gasp arose. Even the defense team looked momentarily stunned. 20 years was far beyond the typical white-collar sentence. It was a statement that if you use your power to exploit and cheat, you will pay a price equal to the weight of your transgressions. Alexander's composure cracked. He stood suddenly, finally standing in front of Judge Coleman, and shouted in disbelief, "You can't do this to me. I'm Alexander Steele." His voice reverberated across the courtroom, layered with anger and desperation. Judge Coleman simply replied, "Bailiff, please take the defendant into custody." In that moment, all eyes were on Alexander as the bailiff approached him, instructing him to place his hands behind his back. He stared at Judge Coleman with a mixture of fury and shock. The man who had refused to stand for anyone had now risen to his feet, only to be led away in handcuffs. It was a moment none in that courtroom would ever forget, the poetic final act in a drama of arrogance, power, and justice served. The story of Alexander Steele's sentencing swept the nation. Major media outlets covered the takedown of a titan, emphasizing the symbolic weight of Judge Coleman's ruling. Online, social networks lit up with praise for her unwavering stance. Some critics claimed the sentence was harsh, a political statement rather than a judicial one. Yet the majority opinion leaned toward approving the strong message. No amount of wealth or influence could shield a person from accountability. For Judge Coleman, the aftermath was bittersweet. She had upheld her duties, presiding impartially over a trial that tested her resolve on multiple levels: racial bias allegations, personal attacks, and a relentless onslaught of media scrutiny. She found solace in knowing justice had been served according to the law and the facts. Still, she recognized the complexities. Alexander Steele's downfall was also a reflection of society's broken systems that often let the powerful off easy. This time, the system had worked, but it required an extraordinary level of evidence and the unwavering determination of everyone who came forward. Meanwhile, Alexander Steele began his life in a federal penitentiary, stripped of the luxuries he once took for granted. No longer did cameras follow him with reverence. Now he was just another inmate, assigned a number and a cell. It said that during his first day, he refused to stand when a prison guard entered the room, an act of defiance that earned him immediate disciplinary measures. Hard lessons awaited him, lessons he had long evaded by wielding money and intimidation. In time, Steele Holdings was dismantled, with portions sold off to settle legal claims. Some of the neighborhoods he once planned to develop for massive profits found new, community-oriented buyers, granting a glimmer of hope to local residents. And as for those who lost their jobs or savings in Alexander's grand schemes, a court-appointed administrator worked to repay them from the seized assets. Though the restitution wouldn't fully compensate for their suffering, it offered a measure of redress. If there was one enduring image from this saga, it was the photograph snapped by a quick-witted journalist. It showed Alexander Steele, once the paragon of wealth and arrogance, standing at last only to be handcuffed and led out of the courtroom under Judge Coleman's watchful eye. The photograph spread like wildfire, a testament to the humbling force of justice. In the months following the trial, Judge Coleman continued her work. Other high-profile cases entered her docket, and she handled them with the same rigor. Yet the city of Chicago would not forget this trial anytime soon. Law students studied it as a case example of balancing freedom, fairness, and the flamboyance of a high-profile defendant. Activists cited it as proof that systemic change was possible, even if rare. Business leaders discussed the ethics of corporate governance. On a personal level, Judge Coleman received invitations to speak at universities and legal conferences. She used these platforms to advocate for legal reforms and highlight the importance of judicial independence. She didn't gloat about Alexander Steele's sentencing, nor did she treat it as a personal victory. In her eyes, it was merely the law functioning as it should. As for Alexander, rumors emerged from the prison about his behavior. Some claimed he spent his days filing appeals and harassing fellow inmates. Others said he had become unusually withdrawn, struggling to reconcile his newfound reality with the grandeur of his former life. Whichever story was true, the fact remained. His arrogance had been tempered by the unforgiving steel bars that now surrounded him. In quiet moments, Judge Coleman sometimes reflected on how a single act, refusing to stand for the court, had symbolized the deeper moral failings of a man drunk on power. She recognized that the drama was not about personal ego. It was about a defendant who believed himself above the rules. The outcome reaffirmed a principle she had upheld her entire career, that justice, though imperfect, remains a bedrock of society, and those who defy it with disdain will, eventually, meet their reckoning. Sometime later, a local Chicago journalist interviewed Judge Coleman about the trial's legacy. When asked what she hoped the public would take away, she answered, "This trial wasn't about me or Mr. Steele as individuals. It was about the rule of law. Wealth and power may grant you certain privileges in life, but they do not excuse criminal behavior. I hope this serves as a reminder to every person out there who thinks they can buy their way out of accountability. In my courtroom, justice will always come first." That statement echoed across social media, reinforcing the symbolic power of the trial. In a world where the rich often appear to live by their own set of rules, the downfall of Alexander Steele stood as a cautionary tale. It was an affirmation that, sometimes, against the odds, truth and fairness can prevail over arrogance and greed. Outside the courthouse, life went on. People hustled to work, children played in parks, and the city thrummed with its usual energy. Yet for those who had witnessed the drama unfold, there was a renewed faith in the possibility of justice, that even the mightiest among us could be held accountable when they stepped out of line. And so ended the saga of a billionaire who refused to stand for a black judge, only to have his empire shattered. The final image remained etched in the public consciousness, a once invincible man, finally standing in submission, handcuffed before the law he had tried to circumvent. A vivid lesson that, despite all appearances, no one is above the system we entrust to safeguard our collective values. And there you have it, the shocking tale of a billionaire so consumed by his own ego that he believed he could trample over law, decency, and anyone daring to challenge him. By refusing to stand for a black judge, he revealed a cold disrespect for all that the courtroom represents, only to be stunned when justice slammed back harder than he ever thought possible. This powerful story is a testament that no matter how rich or influential someone may be, they are never above the truth. If you found this story gripping and want more tales of drama, justice, and unexpected twists, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video to spread the word that karma does come around, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. Your support helps keep these compelling narratives alive. Together, let's continue unveiling the hidden truths that make us question, wonder, and ultimately believe in the power of justice.